Hey guys, I just want to take a few minutes to talk just a little bit about the Great Depression. So, last time we talked about the Roaring Twenties, we talked about the surface prosperity, and all of that stuff that happened in the 20s is going to lead to the Great Crash of 1929, which in turn is going to lead us into the Great Depression. Now, like I said before, we do have a bunch of different panics and crashes and depressions all throughout American history. This one is the biggest. And one of the reasons for that is because of some of the underlying factors that we're going to talk about. So, the Great Depression had a bunch of long term causes that made it something completely unforeseeable, that made it the Great Depression rather than just another depression. One of the big things was weak industries and the overproduction of goods. Both of these have to do with what was going on in World War I. In World War I, we very quickly converted to a wartime economy. Even before we were actually involved, we were doing a lot of selling weapons and things like that, right? We're doing a lot of wartime kind of stuff. It's very, very difficult to convert to a peacetime economy, and we didn't do that great of a job of it. So we're making too much. Things like food, we were producing too much because that's how much we'd had to produce during World War I, and there's nobody to buy it. We're also going to see the uneven distribution of income. Again, we talked about that when we talked about the Roaring Twenties. We talked about how trickle down economics didn't really work the way that people thought that it would, and how, with that surface prosperity that we saw in the 20s, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And so having such an uneven distribution of income is actually it's bad for the economy. If the rich have too much of the money, then the poor people can't spend their money. It can't keep our economy going. We also had a really unstable banking system. During this period, you put your money into the bank, and this is something that I didn't get when I was little, you guys. So if you didn't know this, it's okay. Don't feel stupid. When I was little, I thought that banks were basically just like government nonprofit agencies. Like I thought that they just stayed open to hold my money. I didn't know that banks were supposed to make profit. And the way that banks generally make that profit is they take a percentage of the money that you deposit with them and they do things like invest it. They give it to people in loans, they invest in the stock market, things like that. That's how they make their profit. Because when you give money in a loan, you're getting interest, stuff like that, right? So that's how they make their money. What that means, though, is that if I have $100 in my checking account, maybe $50, $60 of it, something like that, is actually technically not there. It's being given out in loans. And the way that banks rectify that is people usually don't come and withdraw their entire checking all in one day in mass numbers. All right, so it kind of hinges on the idea that people are going to keep their money in the bank when they're not using it, and that most people aren't going to drain their checking accounts every single day. That, without protections, means that if people start freaking out and they're all taking their money out of the bank is going to run into some issues because they're not going to have enough money to give back to everybody. They've given away in loans and things like that. We're also going to see the weak international economy as a huge impacting factor on the Great Depression. Remember, after World War I, things were looking good in the United States, but not so much in the rest of the world. And eventually, that's going to have a pretty profound impact on us as well. Right, so when the Great Depression begins, we have a president named Herbert Hoover. Now, Hoover gets a lot of crap for being the guy that screwed up the Great Depression. Something I want you guys to understand, though, is Hoover could not have predicted that the Great Depression was going to be quite as great as it was. So his response is some public works. The Hoover Dam is built in response to the Great Depression. It's to give people jobs. We're also going to found the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. But the two big things that you're going to see during Hoover's presidency are the ideas of volunteerism and rugged individualism. And these are kind of problematic, you guys. They remind me a little bit of when we talked about the Gilded Age and we talked about like social Darwinism, stuff like that. They're kind of reminiscent of those ideas. Right? So volunteerism is the idea that voluntary cooperation would enable the country to weather the Depression. So what does that mean? It means that, kind of like with the gospel of wealth, rich people should give charity and make sure that everybody's doing all right. Just like the problem with Andrew Carnegie's ideas during the Gilded Age was that people don't always do what they should do. It's just kind of, rich people are scared too. They're worried about you losing their fortunes and they don't want to give what they've amassed to other people. So volunteerism doesn't really work. Rugged individualism is the idea that everyone should be able to take care of themselves without the use of handouts, which is great in theory, but useful. Useless. That's what I meant. So I mean, the idea that you should be able to take care of yourself, cool. I would love to be able to take care of myself. However, it's during the Great Depression and all of the jobs are literally gone. It's not that people don't want to work. It's not that people are having issues finding jobs. It's that jobs just cease to exist. So if you have this prevailing idea that you should be able to take care of yourself, and you can't find a job, they're not there, not only are you failing at this idea of rugged individualism, but a lot of people start to feel like they've failed as men, as human beings. And about 3 million are going to become hobos. They live in makeshift shacks, I can say that phrase, that they nickname Hoovervilles, kind of a dig at our boy Hoover. They moved to these shacks after living through the roaring 20s, where you have all the drinking and the dancing and everything's fun and great and wonderful, and you have modern amenities. Now you're living in a shack with no electricity and probably no running water. This is huge, you guys, and it's not just the poor people that are being impacted. Everybody is being impacted by this depression. Families start to break up, birth rates are going to decline. Now, one thing, a lot of the time we have a tendency to think of people starving to death during the Depression. That didn't really happen that much. Malnutrition, instead, is going to run rampant because we're going to see the creation of soup kitchens. I don't know if you guys have ever volunteered at a soup kitchen or something like that, but like when you go, it's not just soup. Like you feed the homeless, right? You give them like a full meal. Well, at this point in time, soup kitchens get their name because it was soup. And soup doesn't necessarily give you all of the nutrients that you need. It'll keep you full enough to survive. It'll keep you going, but that doesn't mean you have everything that you need. And so people aren't starving to death, but they're definitely malnourished. One big thing that we're going to see in response to what Hoover does is something we call the bonus army. And this is about 14,000 unemployed veterans coming together. These guys fought in World War I, and they were promised a bonus that was supposed to be paid in 1945. Well, it's not 1945 yet. We're talking early 1930s. So we still have some time to go, but also these veterans are homeless and malnourished and they don't have any sort of income. And so they're going to march on Washington for the early repayment of their bonuses. The Senate is going to refuse. They don't pass the bonus bill. And a lot of veterans, since they're homeless anyways, stay as hobos in Washington, D.C., which is not a good look for Washington, D.C., you guys. We can't have people on the grass of our nation's capital living in Hoovervilles, right? And so Hoover is going to call in the Army to remove them. He does this after 2 veterans are killed because tension starts to run high. Things get out of hand. But Hoover ultimately is just seen as kind of a douchebag after this point. He is seen as kind of abusing veterans, and that's not what you want when you're running for re-election. So Hoover runs for re-election against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt is our longest running president. And a lot of the reason for that is his response to the Great Depression. People think that he fixes everything. Now, in fairness to both our good friend Hoover and to history in general, FDR doesn't fix everything. His programs, big one is called the New Deal, they don't fix the Depression. They alleviate the Depression. And that's what they're intended to do. They're not intended to actually fix everything. They help people. And after we start helping people, we're able to start recovering. But there are a lot of factors that in the Great Depression, one of the big ones is World War II. But so Roosevelt is elected largely because people hate Hoover now. Again, remember, it's not completely Hoover's fault, but he's not the greatest at his response. And so Roosevelt comes in with this idea that he is going to help us alleviate problems. He creates the New Deal. This is an economic response to counteract the effects of the Depression. So we're going to see a massive public works program, large-scale loans, jobs being created, things like that. Like I said, they don't actually fix anything, but they make things better. He's going to use the concept of the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And all of that is going to focus on what we usually refer to as alphabet soup organizations. These organizations, we call them alphabet soup because most of them have acronyms. But so what FDR is going to do with the 3 R's is he's going to have this idea basically of throwing pasta at the wall. All right, so bear with me. If you've ever cooked like spaghetti or something, this might not be the most efficient way of telling whether pasta is done, but if you throw spaghetti at the wall and it sticks, it's done. I don't know if you guys know that or not. Like, you can try it if you want to. It's not that fun and it wastes some spaghetti, but what FDR did was very similar to the idea of throwing pasta at the wall. He throws a bunch of stuff at the wall, a bunch of different organizations, and whatever sticks, he keeps. And then if it doesn't stick, if it doesn't work, he does away with it and he creates something new. This is going to cause massive government spending. So we're going to be massively in debt, but it does help the American people. These alphabet soup organizations focus mainly on money or creating jobs. Now, in a lot of, especially like high school classes, one of the big things that you do with the Great Depression is you look at all of these organizations, you look at what they do, and that's great, but ain't nobody got time for that, you guys. You guys aren't going to leave this class remembering what all of these alphabet soup organizations do. You know how I know? Because I don't remember half of them. And I have a degree in history. So we're not going to focus on the things that you're not going to remember. We're going to focus on the overarching ideas. And so those big ideas are we need to make sure that people's money is safe, because once their money is safe, once they can go and put their money in the bank, that's going to help our economy recover. And we need to make sure that people have jobs so that they're making money. Right? So for example, we see during this period the creation of the FDIC. The FDIC is still in use today. It's changed a little bit. What it does essentially is it insures your money when you put it in the bank. So it's up to something like $500,000. I can't remember the exact number. I just remember I saw the number and I was like, I'm never going to have that much money at one time. My money is safe. All right. So it ensures a certain amount of money that you put in the bank. And if that bank goes kaput, if it closes, you get that money back. Because one of the problems that people run into with our unstable banking system at the beginning of the Great Depression is if the bank folds and they can't give everybody their money back, your money is just gone. So putting your money in the bank is a risk. The FDIC helps alleviate that. It alleviates that risk. And like I said, we're also going to do a lot of creating jobs, like with the Public Works Administration and things like that. Another really big thing that's going to happen during Roosevelt's presidency is the start of the fifth party system. All right, so we talked about the fourth party system. We talked about how it had to do with there no longer being a focus on the rural areas when we're deciding who's going to be president. And it also had to do with the Republicans kind of abandoning the interests of African American voters. Now, African American voters, though, are still going to vote largely Republican during the fourth party system and even for a lot of the fifth party system. They're going to think of it as the party of Lincoln. But one thing that you are going to understand after this class is over is that the Republicans from the Civil War are not the same as the Republicans today. They kind of do the hokey pokey, they turn around. The Republicans and the Democrats, as they existed during the Civil War, have completely different ideas. They're the same name, but they are different entities from the political parties of today. And so the fifth party system, we're going to see even more changes amongst the Republicans and the Democrats. And we're going to see a distinct shift of black voters at the national level to the Democratic Party. All right, so we're not going to see a whole lot of shift in the South. Right? A lot of the Democrats in the South are still very similar. The Democratic politicians are still very similar to Civil War era Democrats. And it's not going to be until the end of the 60s that we really see that change. But at the national level, black people are going to start voting for Democrats rather than Republicans. And that's important for a big reason, you guys. It's important because we're going to see the party platforms, the ideals, the things that these parties stand for change throughout U.S. history. Now we think of the Republicans as conservative and the Democrats as liberal. But remember, when we talked about my boyfriend Teddy Roosevelt, we talked about how he was a liberal Republican and Taft was more moderate to conservative, and there was a conservative wing of the Republicans. And so it's not until later on that we start to see that dichotomy, that we start to see the Republicans and Democrats divide themselves in that way. And so this is how we're going to begin that shift. All right, so let's talk about some specifics from the New Deal, okay? One of the first things that FDR is going to do is he is going to declare a national banking holiday. This is kind of like a little magic trick for the American people. We're going to use some reverse psychology a little bit. So what FDR does is he closes all of the banks. Every single bank is closed for a few days, okay? When they open, he says he's only going to allow solvent banks to reopen. Now, by this point in time, pretty much all of the banks that were going to fold have already folded. Pretty much all the banks that are solvent, they're already, it's already a thing. This has already happened, but we don't know it. The American people, they don't know it. They don't understand that it's cool to put your money in the bank. So he's going to try to restore faith in the banking industry by closing everything, sending in investigators, making sure things are cool, and then telling them that it's safe to put their money in the banks. Not very many banks close permanently as a result of the national banking holiday, but people put their money back in the banks. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that your bank is going to close, you go and you take all your money out of the bank. And what actually causes the bank to close is everybody going and taking their money out of the bank. So if nobody had thought that it was going to close and nobody had taken their money out, the bank would have been fine. So that's what the national banking holiday does. It makes everybody think everything's going to be fine, and because they think it's fine, it is fine. Another huge thing we're going to see from FDR that seems small is his fireside chats. He's going to give a total of about 30 radio shows that are used as a way to reassure Americans that the country is going to recover. He kind of talks real soft, real slow, and reassures everybody in this like soothing voice. Everything's going to be okay. Here's what I'm doing. Here's how I'm fixing things. Don't panic. We're good. All right. And the leadership of a president and how the president deals with a crisis is going to largely reflect the response of the American people. So, for example, 9/11. Some of you might have been alive for that. I'm getting old, so a lot of you guys maybe weren't, but 9/11 happened, and George W. Bush's response to 9/11 was characterized with a very swift response. It was characterized with a lot of patriotism. And so that's how the country responded. There were flags everywhere. Like if you weren't alive for this, or if you were really little, you might not remember. Flags everywhere. Patriotism was, I would say, at an all-time high. It was America the Beautiful. You guys, it was like joining hands and singing Kumbaya, because you had this president saying everything's going to be okay. We're good. We're going to get the guys that did this. We'll figure all that out. We've been attacked, but we're going to come together and we're going to be stronger. And you really saw that reflected in the American people's attitude. And so how the president deals with any sort of big crisis is hugely important. So this response made people feel better. And so the American people feeling better and them seeing FDR's response calmed them down. There are a couple of big things that happen in the New Deal that don't really fall into that alphabet soup category. One of them I want to talk about is the Indian New Deal. So the so-called Indian New Deal is going to do some big stuff for Native Americans. Now remember, the last time we really talked about Native America, we were talking about closing the western frontier. We talked about the Dawes Severalty Act that takes away a lot of tribal autonomy. So we're finally going to see during the Great Depression the repeal of the Dawes Severalty Act. We're going to give tribes back a lot of their power, and we're going to provide them loans for economic development. Because here's the thing, you guys. As far as American people, African Americans are hit the hardest by the Great Depression. They are the most negatively impacted, with the exception of Native Americans. Native Americans at this point in time, they're not considered to be American citizens. They're outside of American citizenship. And so the aid that we get from like the alphabet soup corporations, that doesn't go to Native Americans. And so the Indian New Deal is intended to kind of help them, because they're starving. Things are not going great. We're also going to see the passage of the Social Security Act. This is something that impacts you guys today, whether you realize it or not. If you work, you pay in money to Social Security. If you become disabled, or once you get older, you are going to draw Social Security. You have a Social Security number, and that starts here. That didn't exist before the Social Security Act. It is one of the most complicated, far-reaching laws to ever pass Congress, something that I don't think ever would have passed without the circumstances of the New Deal. It is the closest thing to socialism that we have ever seen in the United States. It is a kind of socialist, it's a socialist policy. Um, but it is something that was huge and is huge. It provides for federal, state unemployment insurance, old age pension, disability, all sorts of stuff. And now we use our social security number for everything, right? All right, so we've talked about some of the good things that FDR did, right? He also did some kind of shady stuff, which we're gonna forgive him for. Abraham Lincoln did some really shady stuff too, you guys. I feel like to be president of the United States, you have to be capable of a little bit of shade. So he does this. It was not right. He should not have done it, but my man tried. Okay, so FDR is going to come up with something called the courthouse packing plan. The idea of this is a lot of his New Deal legislation was being struck down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was kind of conservative at the time, and they were like, this looks a lot like socialism. We don't like it. So they would strike down these alphabet soup corporations and things like that. And FDR was like, no, this is great, this is working, how dare you? And so what he thinks is, well, we just need some more Supreme Court justices, because if we have more of those guys, I can appoint them, because that's the president's privilege. He gets to appoint Supreme Court justices. So he's like, if we just add on a couple, I can get me some liberal guys on there that'll agree with me. They'll help. What he says is they'll help balance the court. They'll balance the opinion. Here's the problem with that. Supreme Court justices are appointed for life for a reason. And it's so that things like this can't be done, so that the Supreme Court can't be manipulated by a president, by Congress, by anybody. How well that works is kind of up to you, up to your own interpretation. But I will say the purpose of the Supreme Court justices being appointed for life is so that once they're there, they don't have to fear their political party removing them because they're not siding with that political party. So, for example, recently there was a Supreme Court decision that said that LGBTQ plus members of the community are included in the Civil Rights Act, that they fall under gender. And this is a huge decision. Whether you agree with it, don't agree with it, it's pretty monumental. And it was a 6-3 ruling. Now, I don't political science, all right, so this isn't my area of expertise, but it was a 6-3 ruling, and people were really surprised at some of the more conservative leaning and some of the more libertarian leaning justices who sided with this decision. And if the Republican members of our Supreme Court were answerable to their party, they might not have had the guts to make that decision. That's why something like the courthouse packing plan is awful. We don't want that. We don't want the Supreme Court justices to think that every time they make decisions that the president doesn't like, we're just going to add Supreme Court justices, right? That takes away their power. Okay? So that was FDR's plan. It was shady. It didn't pass. Now, to add insult to injury, you guys, not only did we have in the Midwest the Great Depression, we also had this huge environmental thing going on called the Dust Bowl. This is a period of severe dust storms that damages the ecology and the agriculture of the prairies. And so what people are going to do, we're going to call them exodusters. They're quite literally just going to pack everything up and leave. Because dust storms sounds like whatever, there's some dust going on, just go inside, calm down, don't freak out. But these dust storms were so severe that cattle would be grazing during these storms, and people would come out, the cows would be dead, and there would be like holes in the cattle from these dust storms. It was insane, you guys. So a lot of people are just going to pick up and move. That's going to cause pretty profound impact, though, on the economics of the prairies and of the rest of the United States. You're going to have a bunch of people moving, looking for jobs where jobs already didn't really exist. So it's not really going to help matters. Now, there are a bunch of critics of the New Deal, but not just in the way that you would think of them. The American Liberty League is going to oppose the New Deal. They're going to say it's too liberal. So is Father Charles Coughlin. That's kind of what you'd expect, right? People being like, you're doing too much, FDR, you should dial back. Charles Coughlin, this guy, he's kind of interesting. Because originally he supports FDR. He starts, though, he's a Catholic priest. He has a radio show and he starts preaching anti-Jewish fascist rhetoric when he thought the president had gone too far, and he eventually gets taken off the air because he gets really fascist. Remember, we don't like isms that aren't capitalism. Fascism is one of those we're not really fans of. He gets taken off the air, but he is going to be very anti-FDR and his liberal policies. These two guys, though, Dr. Francis Townsend and Senator Huey P. Long, who is called Kingfish, by the way, both of them are going to think that FDR isn't going far enough. So Huey Long, he's an interesting character. He was a senator, and he comes up with an idea called Share Our Wealth. And this is essentially the concept of Robin Hood. Okay, he wants to take the excess of wealth after a certain amount, just cap that amount and say, okay, well, after you've made this much money, we're gonna tax your money at this percentage after you have that much money, and we're just gonna take money from the rich and we're gonna redistribute it to the poor. Poor people loved it. Rich people, not so much. They weren't fans, and it was something that never passed. It was a very, very, very much too much like socialism. It was very much socialism, so we didn't like it. This guy, though, Francis Townsend, he comes up with a pretty doable idea, but again, it gets written off as too close to being socialist, communist, and all of the isms that we don't like. He comes up with the old age revolving pension plan. Now remember, we have already passed the Social Security Act. We already have this old age pension. And so what Townsend proposed is that we take that pension and we put some stipulations on it. One of the reasons that the New Deal programs don't actually fix the depression and they just alleviate the problems is because they don't actually fix the economy. The economy requires constant money going into it. People have to make money and they have to spend money. One of the problems is that people, even with these New Deal programs, they were worried and they wouldn't spend all of their money. Kind of like if you got one of the COVID stimulus checks and you put it in your savings account. The purpose of the stimulus check was to stimulate the economy. It was for relief, for people to be able to pay bills and things, but it was to stimulate the economy, to make sure that money was still being spent so that we wouldn't have a big crash. That was the majority of why a lot of Congress supported the stimulus package, because again, we didn't call it a relief check. We called it a stimulus check, right? I'm going to stimulate that economy. And so what Townsend wanted to do was stimulate the economy by requiring that people receiving a pension spend that entire pension every month. They couldn't have any leftover. They couldn't put it in savings. And that would have actually generated money within the economy. It would have probably done some good stuff, but we ended up not going with it. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about how people deal with the depression, how people deal with bad stuff in general, and that's escapism. Escapism is the tendency to seek distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, especially by seeking entertainment or engaging in fantasy. The escapism that we see during the Great Depression is going to largely have to do with movies. People are going to go and spend money going to the theater even though they don't really have any money to spend, because you can escape from reality for a little while. So we're going to have things like The Wizard of Oz, which are really fantastical worlds outside of our own world. Fairy tales are going to be huge, and so are historical dramas. Part of the reason for that, I would argue, is you can go into this world that used to be our world, and you can see how terrible things were, but at the end, everything's okay. So it kind of reminds you that things are going to be okay now. And there's a big correlation, I would argue, between the escapism of the 1920s and what's happened with the COVID pandemic. People have done things like put stuffed animals in their windows so that parents can drive around, their kids can see stuffed animals. They've done a lot of sidewalk chalk art. People have started like learning how to bake banana bread. I started adult coloring because clearly I have absolutely no life. Like, people have started picking up all of these new hobbies to entertain themselves, but not just to entertain themselves during a quarantine, but also to keep their minds off the bad stuff. Another good example, though, of escapism, because I don't want you to think it's always movies, is comic books. Comic books like Superman and Batman start coming out in the late 1930s during the Great Depression. And so you see superheroes as a means of escapism. Now, everything that FDR did, though, wasn't enough. Remember, helping. It was helping people. It was alleviating the strain of the Great Depression. But even on his best day, Roosevelt couldn't make the Depression end. Like I said, that's going to be a combination of factors, and we're gonna see the end really come with World War II. Anytime FDR tries to pull back on government spending, bad things happen. And we call that the Roosevelt recession. There's this economic downturn that happens from 1937 to 38, and it occurs as FDR tries to cut New Deal funding and pull back on programs. All right, so for this last slide, you guys are going to need to go into the PowerPoint and watch the video. This is a
Let's
really
say the United
short, like I
States
think
has
it's like
just
2 to
plunged
3
into the
minute
worst
video,
depression in its history,
kind
and
of
you are the president of those
explaining
same United States. What do you do?
the Great
Well, if your
Depression
name is
in a
Herbert Hoover,
nutshell.
then you
So
would say
go
something about
look at that. It'll
laissez-faire
explain some of the
individualism and do
alphabet
nothing.
soup. You'll
But if
see a
your name's
nice little
Herbert Hoover, then you're also
timeline
going to
of
be
what's going
remembered for
on.
being wrong.
And I'll
So let's
see you
skip
next
ahead a
time
few
when we
years
talk
and say
about
now
World
you're
War II.
Franklin Roosevelt. You have a much better idea, which you call the New Deal. This program ran from 1933 to 35 and broke down into three goals: relief, recovery, and reform. It all started with what became known as the first 100 days, during which Congress passed an unprecedented amount of legislation. First up was a banking holiday. For 2 days, every bank across the country was shut down and investigated. The well-behaved banks were then allowed to reopen while the rest were put under government control. The government then put some broad restrictions over the banks while also creating the FDIC, which would act as insurance for banking deposits. These two measures were designed to restore Americans' confidence in the banking system. Also aimed at restoring confidence were FDR's fireside chats, in which he spoke weekly to the American people through the radio in a reassuring voice and told them what was going on. More practical was the so-called alphabet soup of new government agencies that sprang up. In no particular order, there was the Public Works Administration, which paid people to rebuild roads, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which paid younger people to plant trees, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built hydroelectric dams in Tennessee, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which helped farmers by paying them to not farm, and the National Recovery Administration, which placed productive regulation on industry, just to name a few. But as it turned out, all that wasn't enough. Roosevelt then launched the Second New Deal, which ran from 1935 to 1938. It was basically more of the same, adding the Works Progress Administration for artists and the Social Security Act for old and out-of-work people to the alphabet soup. So, did it work? In a word, kinda. FDR did greatly expand the role of the federal government in people's lives and likely saved the economy from getting much worse. But government spending is a complicated thing. For all the good the New Deal may have done, 1937 and 38 still saw the Roosevelt recession when FDR tried to cut back on spending just a little. And even on his best day, FDR never got unemployment below 16%. That is, until World War II.